Hey, listeners of A Lost Plot. Just a quick announcement before we get into the meat of the content. When I started this podcast about a year and a half ago, I was very interested in learning about what makes us tick as individuals, specifically when it comes to watching movies, why we're interested in them, what makes them so interesting, why they have meaning to us, why I will think of one story years down the road and another one will be completely forgotten the next week. So there's elements in place in stories that can inspire us and characters that we seek to impersonate as we go about our lives. I think that these characters are characters we can look up to in some ways, and all of us find some inspiration from even fictional characters that have never existed in history. I'm just a man. I don't know all the answers. My goal here has always been to explore, to learn, and to grow in this with the people that I'm discussing it with and learning with this whole time. I'm no Joseph Campbell. I'm no Stephen King. I'm no Neil Gaiman. I'm just another guy trying to find out meaning in all of the messages that are out there in these stories. I've learned a lot in this path as I've done this podcast, and this podcast has been a way for me to explore this even more intentionally in my life. I think the podcast has been up to this point maybe too much analysis of the plot line, and it has been too little of a discussion about the meaning of these characters that I was talking about earlier, and the meaning behind their journeys, the values that they hold to, all that stuff that really I'm interested in hasn't been a core concept of this podcast. I saw this earlier on and I tried to incorporate it into the podcast as we went along, but I still saw myself going scene by scene. You would see Frodo, who he is given the ring, then he goes to Rivendell, then he agrees to bring the ring to Mordor, then they lose Gandalf and Moria, etc., etc., all that kind of stuff. And in an attempt to not miss anything in the podcast, I ended up losing the really valuable parts of the podcast to me, and I think to a lot of the listeners as well. So while I had good intention, I think that caused the podcast to lose a little bit of the focus it needed. I have decided at this time to shut down the podcast as it has been. So the podcast is coming back. You will see it next week, but it's going to be remade. It's going to look very different. It's going to have a lot more focus on the characters, the themes, the values presented, and a lot less on the plot line itself as a play by play type of podcast. The part of the plot that I think has been lost in a lot of movies today is the part that really this podcast was originally set out to focus on, and that's what we're going to try to do going forward. So what does that mean going forward? Well, you're going to see three things different if you've been following this podcast very closely. One, there's going to be a change in the content and the structure. So my promise to you right now is you're not going to see the same play by play that we've been seeing in the podcast up to now. Some podcasts are focused on that. That's not going to be the goal of this podcast. And so while there may be some very meticulous, detailed discussions, that's not going to be the primary focus, is to go through every scene in the movies. It's going to be focusing on the characters, the themes, the values as the primary content of the podcast. Secondly, there's going to be updates to the podcast website. So if you're following website, it looks pretty basic right now. We're hoping to really bring all of the content from all the different platforms into a central hub. So anyone who's interested in finding that content can find it very easily. And anything that we create going forward will be found there. That's going to probably release within the next month. So stay tuned and I will let you know when that is officially launched. But the third thing is that there's going to be the rating system as a bigger part of the podcast. Now, some people have liked to give me shade about how the rating system is incredibly subjective. You may have heard that from some of the guests on the podcast in the past. Well, that can't be used against me anymore. Between myself and one of my regular guests, Avalon, we're looking at the system that I use, and we've really refined it, drilled down to make sure that that is clear and accessible to anyone going forward. In fact, we've really tore it back a bit, and so now it's not even a 10-point rating system. It's actually now a 9 points rating system. And that is going to be the content of the podcast today. So I'm very excited to share with you what I think are the most important points of any story that we're analyzing and how those can be tied back to what we remember and what we find valuable going forward. So join me today as we explore the meaning in movies together. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot. Today we are doing another movies worth watching episode. Now this one I'm by myself. Avalon wasn't able to make it today. Andrew's out. It's okay. Today we're going over something that I'm very passionate about and some people have given me shade about. It's the 9-point rating system. Now it used to be 10. Going forward, it's going to be 9 because we've slimmed it down, really trying to focus on what I think are the core pieces to a good story. Now, what I've tried to do is make this accessible to anyone, so I'm going to go over each of those points. And if you have any questions, please reach out. As always, we have access to us on the website. You can send us a line, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Usually, we respond pretty quickly. So, yeah, let's get into it. The 9-point storyline rating system I have used and actually created and refined at this point to help systematically understand how stories matter to us by highlighting the critical elements of a plot. It's generally designed to rate movies. I mean, it could be applied to other tangential types of stories. So, if you wanted to apply it to books, you probably could. If you wanted to apply it to TV shows, you probably could. But the overall substance itself should be mostly geared toward movies due to the content structure of a plot line in a movie. Anyways, there's a couple different sections to this. We're going to start out with the opening. Now, the opening, I believe, is one of the key points to the podcast and to the story itself. And the reason I put an emphasis on it for so long is because everything flows out of the beginning. So if you set yourself up well, people are going to be interested. They're going to keep watching. They're going to be engaged to see what happens next. And so any good creator of content will have this opening down to a T and make sure that it is very refined. All right. So, with that in mind, a good story should be engaging right out of the gate, right? So, in the 9-point rating system, most of these questions that you have that I use, excuse me, to fill out this questionnaire that I've created for myself are at a half a point basis. So most of these questions are a simple yes, no. If it is, they get half a point. If they don't get any points. And then you add it up, see how high the movie ranks. So the beginning of it, the opening scene. The first question we have is the opening scene one that caught your attention and made you want to keep watching? Yes or no, right? This one's very simple. It's very subjective. It doesn't count for a lot for a reason, and that's because the opening scene, there is going to be some subjectivity. If you're really into crime movies and you watch a crime movie, you're probably going to be a lot more easily engaged by this than, say, if you're not into fantasy and it's a fantasy movie, right? So this is going to still have some level of engagement regardless, right? So if you have something like The Lord of the Rings, one opening is the opening with the battle of the armies against Sauron at Mount Doom. That is a very engaging opening versus the opening with Hobbiton, which is very slow and methodical explanation of the characters. Are they both openers in some way? Yeah. If you want to have a more thorough discussion on that point, just watch the podcast on the Fellowship of the Ring that we did a couple of weeks back. But the point is that there are some that are more engaging than others. If you don't find it engaging, you just click no, it doesn't get any score. Second, is the main character flawed in a compelling way? Now, this is key because a lot of characters, especially superhero movies today, have characters that we can't relate to. Part of having flaws tells us that this is someone who really it's a real person. It's someone that we can understand with, relate to, understand what they're going through. And it's important that they don't necessarily have to have, let's just say, um, that doesn't mean that they need to be an anti-hero, right? Or they have to be so flawed that they're always making mistakes. What it does mean is that they can't be a perfect individual who doesn't have any character flaws that makes them unrelatable. and the main character flaws have to be something that makes them engaging. So anyone from Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, who's incredibly flawed, to someone such as Luke Skywalker, who he's not super flawed as a character. He's a pretty nice guy, but he's naive, right? And he's really brash in some situations, and those things come out to bite him in the movies. So there are even small things like that. Like, is it in a compelling way? Is this person someone we appreciate, but is also flawed? Second, oh, excuse me, no, third, are the side characters and supporting cast driven by their own motives and needs, unique from the main character? Yes or no? Now, this one can look a little confusing at first, but the point here is not that they can't have the same goal or outcome as the main character, right? Gandalf also wanted the ring destroyed just like Frodo did, right? But he has other motivations pushing him. He has a broader understanding of the universe that he's in. He has a broader understanding of where he's going to go. Frodo's main goal is to get rid of the ring. Gandalf's main goal is to defeat Sauron, defeat the forces of evil, to stop his once ally Saruman. There's all these other motivations within them, and those have to be compelling for that character apart from the main character. So they can't all just be following along behind the main character and say, we're going to support you to the end for no clear reason. Think some of the Marvel team up movies, but that's aside. That's the third question. The fourth question is the setting believable, or do the settings rules of the universe make sense? So this is one where you're not I don't try to be super picky about this. I try to find plausible explanation, right? If you can think of a good reason why a something can exist in a universe, why a rule could be broken in this situation, then generally I would give this a pass, say yes on this, and give it the half point. But some people are going to be critical about this, right? They're going to say, okay, this doesn't make any sense. Why is there a hyperspeed hopping in Star Wars Episode 9 when clearly that's a violation from all the previous movies' understanding of the rules here? In that case, you cut the point out, right? So that's the main opener. After that, you get everything through here. These next two sections are going to carry you through the what is generally considered act 1, excuse me, where the character then gets really engaged in the conflict itself, right? So the second section here is the obstacle. What stands in the way of the main character and provides the avenue for conflict. Next question. If the main character does not achieve their goal, is it likely they will lose everything they need, quote unquote, to live the life they need to live? Or could they go back to their old way of life if all else fails? Now, this is the idea of lose everything. It's based on what they value in the story, right? It does not mean that they physically have to be risking life and limb in this situation. That helps because that's one of the biggest sacrifices you can make. But if, let's just say, it's all about their career and their career is on the line, or let's just say it's all about saving someone else and that person's life is on the line, there is plenty of situations where something could be at sacrifice or lost because of the actions they take that doesn't directly lead to their death. The point is, if they lose this, they go back to the life that they used to live, if possible, and something's seriously missing from their life, right? They feel like they've lost everything. That's what it needs to convey in this scene. If it does look like that their life is going to be irrevocably damaged by taking on this task and failing, then you answer yes to this question. But if they could just go back to their old way of life, the answer is no. Next question in the obstacle section is the villain or obstacle in the way of the main character compelling? Do they appear to have the means, motivation, and skill to destroy the main character to achieve their own ends? Yes or no? Now, this one is about the villain. I love compelling villains, so I wished I could score this one higher, but at the end of the day, the villain is only an opposing force to the hero itself, and so they can't be rated too highly because there's a lot of other ways to develop conflict than just the villain. You can have enemies such as the tornado in Wizard of Oz, or such as I mean, if you want to go as something silly as sharks in Sharknado, right? You can have enemies that are not cognizant, right? Not someone like Sauron or someone like Morgoth or someone like uh Voldemort. They don't have to be super evil cognizant beings. And so that doesn't mean that they just have to have a compelling reason to be opposed to the main character and have the means and skill to defeat them. Third section is entering the fray. This is the end of the first act, which is covered in this section. So, entering the fray. What causes or forces the main character to go on the journey of the plot? All right. Now, this is where they go from where they are currently, what pushes them to actually go and take on the enemies of the world. Why does Frodo go out into the world and take the ring? Or why does he go from Rivendell to take the ring to Mordor, right? This is where he really is committed, or she is really committed to the forces at hand. And there's two questions in this section as well. One, is there an ideal the main character stands for? Something about their character or situation that transcends their situation and makes their entering the situation the right thing to do. Now, this is part of the values, morals presented. At the end of the day, how is this movie going to be remembered? It's going to be remembered relative to what the characters stand for. How can we look at that and remember that going forward? Well, what kind of person were they? And this is where you set that. They have to stand for something at this point in the movie. You might not know them earlier on, which is why the question isn't earlier on in the questionnaire. But at the end of the day, if they don't stand for something, it's not going to really tug at your heartstrings, and you're not going to be remembering it years down the road. So this is a critical question. The next question in the list is the main character's goals they are trying to achieve a noble goal? Something worthy of pursuing and significant for their life? Are they fighting for small pennies? That's the real question we're asking here. Now, if they are actually fighting for something that's noble for them, it doesn't have to be noble in our viewpoint. It just has to be something compared to the life that they're living or the situation that they're in. Is this something that's significant and difficult? If it is, based on the contrast of where they are currently to where they could be, then yes, you give them that half point. If not, then there goes the half point. So pretty simple. There you go. That's all of the first act. Now, if you look at that in the 9-point rating system, that's the first 4 points. So a lot of this is beginner heavy. And that's intentional because the beginning sets the stage for everything else. And if they set this right, most of the rest of it should go out along pretty well. The next couple points are going to really emphasize that, but everything else should be set up well if they did that correctly. But let's move on. The second act is carried on in one question, and that's because this is all that the middle should do. This is also probably the most important question in every story, and that is, does the main character's situation get worse as the story goes on? Okay? So if to further explain this, the hero is thrown from a bad situation to a worse situation with losses that cannot be reversed. And this is on a 5-point system. So 1, not true. 2, which would be like a 0, excuse me. 2, sort of not true. 3, somewhat not true. 4, somewhat. 5, somewhat true. And then 6, very true. Right? And that on that system puts you at about half a point between 0 and 20 and 2.5 points, excuse me, to rate that. The purpose here is that 2.5 points is on this one question because the scale that you can draw the main character from a bad situation to a worse situation and still trap them in the plot is what keeps us engaged, right? One of the great things about the Mission Impossible movies is that they're very good at taking the main character and throwing Ethan Hunt out of the frying pan into the fire in a regular situation. So it's not like it gets any better. It's regularly getting worse, regularly getting more intense. And while they might be getting closer to the goal, they're having sacrifices along the way, right? Someone of their good friends dies. They lose communication. They get hurt where they can't walk the same. All of those kinds of things that occur. That is what you want to see going on in the story. And the better that they can do that, a lot of other things really fall away because you will still be very engaged in the story. So That is why that has 2.5 points. And that's the main gist of the middle of the story. With that, let's move on to the final act. And the final act has a couple of the really big, heavy hitter ideas that come into play. So this really gives you the end feel, which is why we still have a significant rating left here. But we start out with Revelation. Revelation has big reveals, shocking scenes, and twist endings. Okay, so that's what this wants to convey. It has two questions. Pretty simple. One, there was a revelation in this movie which changed everything. True or false? This is pretty simple. The idea here is when you watch this movie, did the main character or you get revealed information that goes, oh my goodness, everything that came before it completely changed, right? If so, there goes half a point, right? Second, there was a knockout surprise at the climax slash ending of the movie. True or false? Now, this is obviously one of the hardest sections to get right. I think it's very easy, especially with a content saturated world. It's hard to get a ending that no one can predict. That being said, if they can surprise you by introducing an ending that you didn't expect that really gets at your heartstrings and goes, oh my goodness, they survived and they succeeded in this situation, then you give it that half point with a true instead of a false. Okay, next section in Act 3, transformation. People change, lessons are learned, and universal truths are told. This one has 3 questions, and only 2 of them are super actually scored for, but the last one is just to almost prove to yourself that you know what you're answering or you know how to answer this question. So, first off, does the main character grow as a person? Are they better off morally, spiritually, etc., for having gone through this situation? Yes or no? This goes back to the character development talked about earlier, but at the end of the day, we want to see people that aren't just going through life doing these adventures. We want to see them grow and become better because of the actions they took in this movie. If the answer is yes, then that means that they gets half a point. Second, does this movie have a theme? Yes or no? This is pretty clear. It should probably be tied to the character development of the main character, to the conflict between the main character and the obstacle they're trying to overcome, whether that's a physical villain or not. But if it has a theme, just give it a yes. That's another half point. The third question is name the main theme of this movie. Now, you can't just, because you like the movie, say, okay, or because you're in the throes of oh my goodness that movie was amazing when it wasn't actually amazing. You need to actually write out what you believe the theme of the movie is to confirm to yourself that this actually has a theme. You know, some people walked out of Star Wars episode 9 when I watched it years ago in the theaters and said, wow, that is the best Star Wars movie that ever existed. They were not thinking that 3 weeks later, but in the middle of watching that in a theater environment, they thought, wow, this was an amazing movie. Theater environments can affect how you feel about the movie, so don't let that happen. Name the theme of the movie. That should help you to really put that in perspective. Okay, last section. It's the closure or denouement. The last scene. How does the movie leave you? And this has one question. This is the only question in this whole 9 point storyline rating system that has a less than 5 point possibility. So, in this case, you select one of the following. 1, this story left me unsatisfied. 2, this story left me satisfied. And 3, this story left me with the desire to watch the next one. Now, that's rated on a 0, a 0.25, and a 0.5 system. What that does is that makes sure that does the story, it's not super critical, but if they leave you with the desire of wanting more, that means that they still told the story correctly. Not only did they complete the story, but they give you a sense of, wow, that was so good. I want to see what that person does next, right? A good story should leave you wanting more without telling you too much. And if they do that, they get half a point. So that's it. If you look at the overall story, the first act should have 4 of the points. The second act should have 2.5 of the points. And the last act should also have 2.5 points, which together makes the 9 point storyline rating system. I hope you guys all enjoyed. This is how I rate my movies. and how I will be rating movies going forward. It's pretty simple. Anyone could fill this out in 2 minutes. So I hope to make this available to you all soon if you want to just fill this out pretty quickly anytime you're watching a movie. But until then, it's probably not going to be up until the website's up. I'll give you more on that later on. Anyways, that's the 9 point storyline rating system. I hope you guys all enjoyed. We will be back next week with our regular movie reviews. And I look forward to seeing you guys then with a new and improved podcast. Thank you guys. Hey everyone, one last thing. This podcast takes a lot of time and effort to put together. If you find any value from this, I would love if you could give back with 5 seconds. Leave us a review. Just hit those stars on the app you're listening to and let others know what they should think of our podcast. And if you're a super fan, just write a little note there. Let them know why they should listen to the podcast. Other people find us because of just one small fingerprint on your keyboard. So I would really appreciate just that one small gesture. It is because of listeners like you that I am pleased to announce an expansion of the content of this podcast to include animated movies. You not only asked for it, but you made a compelling case to me to tell me why this should be in the podcast. Comedy and romances are still out as primary genres today, but yes, from Frozen to Lion King, there's a smorgasbord of on the table of options available to everyone now. So if you want to leave more reviews or more content or want to see some specific content, please reach out. We do listen, we do hear, and we're incorporating that into the content you will be listening to going forward. Thanks again.